Today, class, we are going to be reading Extra Yarn by Barnett. And as we can see, there's a ton of yarn. And this little girl who we're going to find out about who she is and why she has all this yarn and all the animals. And I think this might be her dog. I don't know. We'll have to read and find out. Oh, and that might be her dog. I don't know, all the animals. And they have like knitted sweaters. Let's read. On a cold afternoon in a cold little town where everywhere you looked was either the white of snow or the black of soot from the chimneys, Annabelle found a box filled with yarn of every color. What do you think she's going to do with all of this yarn? That's a good idea she could do with the yarn. Let's find out what she does with the yarn. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabelle was done, she had some extra yarn. So she knit a sweater for Mars too. But there was still extra yarn. What do you think she's going to do with all of her yarn that she still has after making herself a sweater and her dog Mars a sweater? Let's see what she will do with all of her extra yarn. And when Annabelle and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabelle. "No, I'm not," said Nate. Do you think Nate was jealous? He might have been. Let's read to see if Nate was jealous. But it turned out he was. We were right, class. Nate was just so jealous. And even after she made a sweater for Nate and his dog and for herself and for Mars too, she still had extra yarn. There's Nate and his dog with their sweaters. And then there's Annabelle and Mars, her dog, with sweaters. And there's still yarn wrapped around the tree. I think Mars is attached to the yarn. And after school, Annabelle's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet," shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone. Annabelle, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." "Then I'll knit one for everyone," Annabelle said, "so they won't have to turn around." "Impossible," said Mr. Norman. "You can't." Do you think Annabelle's going to be able to knit a sweater for all of her classmates and for Mr. Norman? She might be able to. That's a good answer. But it turned out she could, and she did, even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabelle still had extra yarn. Do you think Annabelle's ever going to run out of yarn? I don't know. Let's read. So she knit a sweater for her mom and her dad and for Mr. Pelton and for Mrs. Pelton and for Dr. Palmer and for little Lewis. Do you think she still had extra yarn after making it for all of these people? She could have. She made sweaters for everyone except Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts with the snow up to his knees. "No sweater for me, thanks," said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat, and even then, Annabelle still had extra yarn. Do you think that Mr. Crabtree was cold? He looks a little cold, doesn't he? He's in the snow in shorts and a t-shirt. But maybe his hat kept him warm. She made a sweater for all the dogs and all the cats and for other animals too. Soon Annabelle will run out of yarn. But it turned out she didn't. So Annabelle made sweaters for things that didn't even wear sweaters. That's silly. There's a house with a sweater on it. You think your house would have a sweater on it? If so, what color would you have your house be with a sweater? Blue? You would have your house be blue? That's a cool color. Things began to change in that little town. Look at all the houses with all the yarn. All the sweaters, too. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn, and people came to visit from all around the world to see the sweaters and to shake Annabelle's hand. Annabelle was becoming famous for her infinite yarn box. Look at Mars. I don't think the lady wants to pet Mars. One day, an archduke who was very fond of clothes sailed across the sea and demanded to see Annabelle. Does anyone know who an archduke is or what an archduke is? Yeah. They are. They do run the world over in Europe. And they're pretty famous too. And they came all the way over to see Annabelle. Little girl, said Archduke, I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I am willing to offer you $1 million. No, thank you, said Annabelle, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. Why don't you think Annabelle wants to sell the yarn? Maybe she doesn't want to let it go, that's right. Maybe she wants to continue to knit sweaters the rest of her life. Let's see. The Archduke's mustache twitched. $2 million, he said. Annabelle shook her head and said, no thanks. $10 million, he shouted. Take it or leave it. Leave it, said Annabelle. I won't sell the yarn. And she didn't. For $10 million, would you sell the yarn? I might sell the yarn for $10 million. So that night, the Archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabelle's house, and they stole the box and took it to the Archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea. He robbed Annabelle's house for the yarn. Back to his castle, the Archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair. Then he took out the box, and he lifted the lid, and he looked inside. What do you think is going to be inside the box? Do you think that the magic yarn is still going to be in the box? Let's see. His mustache quivered, it shivered, it trembled. The Duke hurled the box out the window and shouted, little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again. That's not very nice, is it, class? But look, there's Annabelle. What's that? The box. It turned out she was. Look at her with all of her yarn. She was still happy. And all the animals. The end. So now, class, that we read the story about Annabelle and her magical box of yarn that she was able to make all of her townspeople, and she became famous for her box of yarn, we are now going to create our own box of yarn. So you're going to have this sheet, and you're going to go back to your seat, and you have this box and your paper, and you're going to color an object that you would create a sweater for. So what would you create? Remember I asked that question in the story, what would you create with the extra yarn? So now this is your chance to illustrate it. You're going to draw it. So you're going to draw whatever you would create for your box with your yarn. And then on the back, you're going to write a paragraph about why you chose to make a sweater or to use your yarn in that way, and why it's important to you.